Quran is kalamullah. It is the speech of Allah. The Quran is kalamullah. It is the speech of Allah. Just take time to reflect on that. Allah has sent us a message. We have direct access to that message. You can read that message yourself and reflect on it yourself. Do we realize what a high status the Quran has? When you realize that the Quran is on such a high level, it is the kalam of Allah, it is the speech of Allah, it is Allah speaking directly to us, then this should cause us to pay more attention to it, to take it more seriously, to spend more time with it. Because this is no ordinary book. This is Allah's message to you and to me and to all of us. Imam Al-Ghazali then tells us in his second tip on how to do Tadabbur, he tells us that when we are reflecting on the Quran and when we first take time to realize that this is the kalam of Allah, we should then praise Allah. We should do zikr. We should express gratitude to Allah for giving us the Quran. So our tadabbur should begin from a place of gratitude, from a place of dhikr, that we thank Allah for sending us this book. We thank Allah for making us Muslims. We thank Allah for giving us direct access to His kalam. So we begin from a place of gratitude. And what these two tips do, recognizing that the Quran is kalamullah and being grateful to Allah, what this does is, it makes us start our recitation of the Quran from a position of being connected to Allah. So you're not reciting Quran just as a ritual. You're not reciting Quran because everybody else is doing it. You now have this direct connection with Allah, that you recognize this is kalamullah and you are thankful to Allah for sending it to you, so you are going to approach it in a very special way. The third tip that Imam Al-Ghazali gives us is to be focused, to have your heart present in your recitation of the Quran, to be focused. We know as human beings, our thoughts waver, right? Especially in this day and age where everybody's always consuming micro content. It's become very hard for people to pay attention to things for long periods of time. But as Muslims, we must train ourselves to do so. We must train ourselves to be able to focus. Whether it's on our salah, or whether it's on reciting Quran, or even when it comes to our work and our studies, we must be able to focus and to commit to something for a long period of time. And so Imam Al-Ghazali, he reminds us that when reciting Quran, we must focus. Our heart, our attention should be entirely on what we are reciting. It's not enough that you just recite the Quran. You must give it your full attention. And again, these things are all working together. When you understand that this is Allah's kalam, and when you thank Allah for His kalam, you will give it more attention than when you are just reading it ritually. Right? All of these things work together to build up towards the tadabbur. And then tip number 4, Imam Ghazali tells us, now you do tadabbur. Now you sit and you reflect. So it's not that you just open the Quran and say, okay, I'm going to do tadabbur. No, you have to build up to it. You have to put yourself in the right mindset for it. And to put yourself in the right mindset for it, you have to remember Allah. You have to remember where the Quran is from and what the Quran is about, and you have to focus. Now that you are focused and you are connected to Allah, now you can reflect on the Quran. Now you can take time to sit and think, what is Allah saying to me? What is the message that I'm supposed to get out of this verse, out of the surah, out of the story? And you can take time to think over the Quran and its personal connection to your life. We know from the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he would do tadabbur in his tahajjud, to such an extent that Aisha radiallahu anha narrates that one night he just recited one verse over and over again in his tahajjud, because he was reflecting on the meanings of that verse. He was doing tadabbur on that verse. When was the last time we took a verse of the Quran and we just sat and we recited it over and over again, thinking about what does this verse mean? How does this verse apply to my life? What is Allah trying to tell me in this verse? This is tadabbur. You focus on a verse, you focus on a surah, you focus on a passage, and you ask yourself, what is Allah telling me in this passage? Then Imam Ghazali says, you should try to understand the Quran. You cannot do tadabbur of the Quran if you don't understand it. Right? You cannot do tadabbur of the Quran if you don't understand it. This is the biggest barrier for many of us when it comes to tadabbur, that we don't understand the Quran. And of course, Imam Al-Ghazali was speaking to a Arabic audience, an audience whose first language was Arabic, so he didn't have to discuss the language barrier. But even with people who speak Arabic, there is barriers to understanding the Quran, because you may not be familiar with the history of the Quran. You may not be familiar with specific verses, why they were revealed. You may not be familiar with certain verses and their legal implications. Or if they are talking about historical incidents, what the incident actually is. So you need to put effort into understanding the Quran. And that means that tafsir is necessary for tadabbur. Because one of the conditions for one tadabbur to be acceptable is that it cannot contradict the orthodox tafsir. Meaning, if the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba understood a verse in a certain way, you cannot come with a new interpretation that contradicts that. You can build on top of that, you can add to that, you can go deeper than that, but you can't contradict that. That is the meaning that cannot be changed. Right? So you need to understand the tafsir in order to do tadabbur. And so this means taking time to study the Quran. This means taking time to study tafsir with a scholar. This means taking time to understand the many layers of meaning within the Quran. And tafsir itself is a miracle. Tafsir itself is a miracle. Because there's no other book on earth in which you can spend your entire lifetime reflecting on it and studying it, and you still find deeper and deeper meanings to it. Think about how many volumes of tafsir have been written over the past 1,400 years. Yet more tafsirs continue to be written today. This is a miracle. This is part of the infinite speech of Allah. That Allah's speech is not just infinite in nature, but it's infinite in depth. That no matter how deep you go into the Quran, there's always more deeper meanings to uncover. That you can take a single surah of the Quran and you can have thousands of volumes of tafsir on that single verse of the Quran. And so Imam Al-Ghazali reminds us that he says that the Quran, part of its miraculous nature, is that there's no end to its meanings. So study its tafsir and then do tadabbur, because there's always something more to unlock. And then he says, you should remove any barrier between you and understanding the Quran. You should remove any barrier between you and the understanding of the Quran. Now, in our times, our biggest barrier, which he doesn't mention, is language, right? Because many of us don't understand Arabic. And to overcome this barrier, I will give you a short-term solution and a long-term solution. Short-term solution, have a good translation of the Quran and a good English translation of a tafsir in your home. This is the short-term solution, that you have a good translation and you read the translation. Long-term solution, learn Arabic. Learn Arabic. It's important to understand the Quran in Arabic, because many things are lost in translation. And you're not going to get the same understanding and reflection from a translation that you will from the original Arabic. So in the short term, to overcome this barrier, we can access a translation, keeping in mind that translations have mistakes, translations are human efforts, and many things are lost in translation. But it's still better than nothing. It's still better to have a translation and not to understand it at all. But at the same time, we must understand the human limitations of translation. So to overcome the language barrier when understanding the Quran, it is important that we access its meaning, and this means accessing a translation and over time learning Arabic itself. It's interesting that Imam Ghazali mentions 3 obstacles to understanding the Quran that were common in his time. And to some extent they are common in our time as well. Actually, I'll say some of these are very common in our time. So let's go through the 3 obstacles to understanding the Quran that Imam Ghazali mentioned. Number 1, he said being too obsessed with the tajweed. Very interesting, right? Imam Ghazali said, some people are too obsessed with tajweed. What does this mean? You're so obsessed with being perfect in your recitation and in articulating every letter properly. Some people are so obsessed with this that they've never taken time to study the meanings of the Quran. it's only about how it's recited, not about what does it mean. There has to be some balance here. We have to, yes, learn how to recite the Quran properly, but we also have to understand the meanings. It's not one or the other. So he wants to get some people who only focus on the tajweed to a level of perfectionism, which isn't possible for most people, by the way. Most people cannot be perfect in their tajweed, right? And so he warns against people who are perfectionists in tajweed to the extent that they forget to study the meanings of the Quran. So he says you have to focus on the meanings as well. The second barrier to understanding that he mentions is very important and relevant to our time. And that is sectarianism. That you go into the Quran with your beliefs already formed. And now you're trying to make the Quran match what you already believe. And most of us are guilty of this at some point or another in our lives. That for some topic or another, we already think that we know what's the right answer. Or we already think we know what the religion should say. And so now we're trying to find ways to make the Quran say what we want it to say. So he says you cannot access the Quran with your opinions already formed. You have to be willing to let the Quran shape your opinions. You have to be willing to let the Quran correct you. And you cannot do that with a sectarian mindset. You have to approach the Quran from the humble perspective of, I don't know, Allah knows, whatever Allah says is right. And number 3, very important, he said the third barrier towards understanding the Quran is that our own personal sins and arrogance. Because the Quran is the light of Allah. It is a nur. It is a light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It cannot penetrate the heart that has too much sins and arrogance in it. So part of the tadabbur is istighfar. Part of reflecting on the Quran is that we seek Allah's forgiveness and we try and purify our souls before accessing the Quran, because our sins may be an obstacle between us and understanding the Quran. To finish off, there's a few more tips Imam Ghazali mentioned. Number 7 is to imagine that Allah is talking to you directly. Very important. Sometimes we treat the Quran as if it's talking to a people of the past. The best way to recite the Quran, Allah is talking to you directly. Right? So Imam Ghazali says, every warning, every glad tiding, every command, every prohibition, treat it as if Allah is talking to you directly. That's how you get the best out of it. Number 8, he tells us, be emotionally invested in what you are reading. So earlier he told us to focus in terms of our intellect, to focus on what we are reading. Then he tells us to be emotionally invested in what we're reading. What does that mean? When the Quran describes Jahannam, you should feel fear. When the Quran describes Jannah, you should feel hope and desire for Jannah. When the Quran tells you a story of a prophet, you should be emotionally invested in that story. You should be caught up in that story, going through the emotions with the people in that story. You shouldn't be cut off like you are just reading something that has no effect on you. The Quran is supposed to have an impact on us emotionally. So let it affect you emotionally. Number 9, he tells us to strengthen our connection with the Quran, which means we should recite it more often, we should treat it with respect, and we should do this on a daily basis. It isn't something we should do once in a while. And finally, number 10, Imam Al-Ghazali reminds us to be humble. You cannot benefit from the Quran if you have arrogance in your heart. You have to be completely humble, that this is the kalam of the Creator, and we are just the creation, and Allah knows best, and whatever Allah says is right, and you have to approach it with complete humility. Otherwise, we are not going to benefit from the Quran. So to conclude, we said that in the month of Ramadan, we increase in our recitation of the Quran, and with that we should increase in our tadabbur of the Quran. So we went over 10 tips Imam Ghazali gives in the Ihya Ulumuddin about how to improve the quality of your reflection on the Quran. He tells us to appreciate the source of the Quran, that it is from Allah, to praise Allah and be grateful to Allah when we begin our tadabbur, to be focused and present, do it focused with a present heart. Number 4, to do the actual act of tadabbur. Number 5, to ensure we study the tafsir as well. Number 6, to remove any barriers between us and understanding the Quran. Number 7, to imagine that Allah is talking to us directly. Number 8, to be emotionally invested in the recitation of the Quran. Number 9, to have a strong connection with the Quran. And number 10, to be humble. We ask Allah to grant us the correct understanding of the Quran and to make it the light of our hearts and the guidance of our deeds. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So just a few more points about Tadabbur. One of the mistakes we make is that we overstep sometimes and we don't realize the limits of Tadabbur. So it's important for us to understand that our personal reflections on the Quran cannot override tafsir. It cannot override the orthodox understanding of the Quran. Right? It has to build on top of it. Meaning, if a verse of the Quran is understood in a specific way by all of the ulama of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, there is consensus on how that verse is interpreted, we cannot come today and say, I did Tadabbur and the understanding is wrong. This is my understanding. Right? It cannot contradict the tafsir. It can only build on top of it. Things like Aqidah and fiqh, we learn that through tafsir, not through Tadabbur. Right? We don't extract Islamic rulings or theology through our personal reflections. We have to go with the orthodox tafsir to get our rulings and our Aqidah. So be careful about trying to extract fiqh and aqidah from the Quran without proper scholarly training, because this can be actually a very sinful thing to do. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ warned against people who interpret the Quran based on their own opinions. He warned us not to do this. There are many hadiths prohibiting this. So what should the Tadabbur do? Right? Some people may be asking, okay, if I can't extract rules from the Quran on my own, if I can't interpret it in how I wish, what is the point of Tadabbur? Well, Tadabbur is a personal reflection on how the Quran applies to your life. So it should give us the following benefits. Number one, it should increase your iman. That when you have a personal relationship with the Quran, this should increase your iman. And it should make you feel closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number two, it should give us hope and optimism, and many a times even solutions to our personal problems. So when you are reading the stories of the prophets of the past, and the trials that they had to go through, and the difficulties they faced in life, and how they eventually overcame these problems. If you are emotionally invested in these stories, it will give you hope. It will give you optimism. And sometimes you'll even find the solutions that you're looking for in their stories. And most importantly, the Tadabbur will help us to prioritize. It will help us to realize what is most important. The pleasure of Allah and preparing for the afterlife. Because sometimes our hearts may be filled with anxiety because of a worldly problem. But when you take time to sit and reflect on the Quran keeps reminding you of two key things. Number one, that we are created to worship Allah. Number two, that Day of Judgment is coming and we need to prepare for it. And when you keep coming across these verses over and over again, and you keep reflecting on them over and over again, it helps us to prioritize and to remember that preparing for the Day of Judgment and having a close relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are more important than many of the trials that we face in this world. And they will actually be what helps us get through these trials, even when there are no worldly solutions for them. So Tadabbur is a personal act of worship, to connect our hearts to Allah, to connect our hearts to the Quran, and to benefit spiritually from the Quran. It's not meant to replace tafsir, it's not meant to make us think of ourselves as scholars. It should be done humbly, it should be done for the sake of Allah, it should be done to improve our own spiritual state. And the benefits of it are all spiritual. The benefits of Tadabbur is that you gain a close and personal relationship with the Quran, and through it with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will help power you through life, through the trials of life, and help you prepare for the afterlife as well. We ask Allah to grant us the correct understanding of the Quran. We ask Allah to make the Quran the light of our hearts and the guidance of our deeds. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا وَآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. أقم الصلاة.